We have no photographic evidence of Frankenstein's monster keeping wicket, but we do know that the man who brought that character to cinematic glory took the gloves himself. And if any genre now signifies American cricket, it probably is the one of the horror film. And that is quite sad, because one of the greatest early bowlers was in America. And yet so many cricket fans don't even know that he existed, or literally that America had any cricket at all. And this is a man who Don Bradman called America's greatest cricketing son. And Plum Warner said at the top of his power and speed was at least the equal of the greatest of them all. We are talking about the Philadelphian superstar called John Barton King, or Bart King. In recorded matches, Bart King had 16,000 runs at an average of 33 with 29 hundreds. If you add in all the unarchived ones, because, this was a long time ago, the hundreds goes up to 39. In 1902, he scored 344 in a single game. And the thing is, he wasn't actually a batter. He was a bowler, a devastating quick who took his victims in bulk. His 2,000 wickets came at 10.67. And in first-class cricket alone, he took 415 wickets at an average of 15.65. Even for that era, that's incredible. And it gets more so when you understand that he took 42% of his team's wicket. You may gasp for air now. And on top of all that, Bart King was one of the pioneers of one of the most important things in modern cricket, swing bowling. Of course, they didn't call it back then, they called it swerve, but for some reason we downgraded it to swing. And like most American cricketers of that era, he had played some baseball in his early days. So when he came to cricket, he brought with him the ability to swerve the ball in the air. And like baseball pitchers, he hid the ball in his hand. Remember, this is like 100 years before Wasm Akram would do it. Overarm bowling had been legalized in 1864, but bowlers were still learning their new craft. King figured out that the new ball could swing in the air, and he specifically talked about learning how to use a strong breeze. So King the baseball pitcher used to throw the ball, and King the fast bowler was now doing similar things without bending his arm. But he clearly figured out the mechanics of it, so he worked hard and developed a ball that came in viciously in the air. This ball he called the angler. Sadly, again, we've downgraded the name to only in-swinger. And I know what you're thinking. How good was King? Well, in 1893, the Australian Test squad toured the USA on their way back from an Ashes tour. The Gentlemen of Philadelphia made 525. King made 36 of those, batting at number 11. Then the Australians went out to bowl against him, and they could not handle his swerve bowling at all. He took 7 wickets, and Philadelphia won by an innings. Australian captain Jack Blackham told the Americans, "You have better players here than we have been led to believe. They class with England's best." Classic Australia. Didn't say they classed with Australia's best. King's Philadelphians beat the Australian Ashes side 2 more times. In 1896 and 16 years later in 1912. He took 17 wickets from those matches. But here's the real kicker, I think. King toured England in 1897 and he took 72 wickets at an average of 24. And I know what you're thinking, that's not too bad. But he came back in 1903 and he took 78 wickets at an average of 16. Then he came back in 1908 and it became 73 wickets at 12.26. It was the best bowling average of that summer. And when I say best bowling average and summer, what I mean is, if you include all the English bowlers in county cricket, he still had the best figures. Against Sussex in 1897, he scored 58 and took 13 wickets. 10 of them were bowled, including Ranji. The Jam Sahib later said that it sprung at him like a tiger. He was so impressed that he gifted Barton King a lighter, replete with a ruby and his own insignia. And King could bat. He averaged 20 on those trips. Against Surrey in 1903, he took 6 wickets, but he also made 98 and an unbeaten 113. The truth is, the Barton King was born in the wrong place at the wrong time. He would have played Test cricket had he been born in Australia, England or South Africa. But he had to remain content with playing first class and, let's be honest, mostly substandard club cricket back in the USA. And this was not a guy who was born rich. If they addressed him as Mr. King when he was in England, he would say, no, call me Bart. Since he toured with the Gentlemen of Philadelphia, they would also ask if he was a gentleman, and he would say, no, I'm a professional. He was not born an aristocrat, and he had no qualms to admitting to the fact that he was just a professional cricketer who was really good. But sadly, he did play cricket in an era where it had become a sport for the elite in the USA. And he could play so much because the rich wanted him to play for their sides, so they actually got him a job in the insurance industry. King played for about 2 decades before the First World War, in what we now call the Golden Age of cricket. And his name should be mentioned in the same breath as the other greats of that era, like Hurst and Rhodes, Trumper and Hill, Woolley and Hobbs, Giffen and Trott, Briggs and Lohmann, Stoddard and Jackson, Sinclair and Faulkner. In fact, the rest of them are partners. Maybe that was his issue. He didn't actually have anyone else to partner with. But if you really want to know how good Bart King was, I think this story tells it best. And I can only hope this is true, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. When he was in England, King was so dominant that to get around the rules on having to be from a county to play for them, because in those days that's how that worked as well, one county reportedly offered him the chance to marry a rich local widow if he chose to play for them. You want to know how good Bart King was? He was rich widow worthy. And early cricket has no higher honour. So the USA had one of the greatest bowlers in the world at one stage, and then they had practically nothing for an extraordinarily long time.
You might want to go on the attack against trolls of your favorite player, but to do that you need a good defense, and we choose NordVPN. They are our protection against cyber cutters or when some board has geo-blocked a great clip. NordVPN will help you get through the straight bat of any rights restrictions so that you can watch all the cricket you want. Protect your computer like the fastest, nastiest, scariest bowler in the world is coming for it with NordVPN today. That's nordvpn.com/KIMBER. Go Nord today.
There is evidence of Dutch settlers in Manhattan, New Amsterdam, playing a game of hitting the ball in 1656. And some have argued that this might be cricket, but to be honest, there's no real proof of that. The first definitive mention of the game is in the diary of William Byrd, a British planter, author, and slave owner in Virginia. He wrote, "I rise at 6 a.m. and Colonel Ludwell, Nat Harrison, and Mr. Edwards and myself played cricket." There's no doubt that the sport became very popular in the USA over the 18th century. The first recorded match was in 1751 between New York City and a London 11. That was 7 years after the first laws of cricket were written in England. And when Benjamin Franklin returned from England in 1754, he actually brought a copy of the early version of the laws with him. The Americans also invented a sport called wicket. There were 30 fielders and 3 innings, and the matches got over inside a day. In 1778, 2 years after the USA became independent, George Washington played wicket, well, at least once. Of course, baseball itself is either taken from cricket or shares a common ancestor with the sport. And so wicket might have been just a combination of those two things. But after independence, the Americans lost interest in most things British, but cricket remained surprisingly popular for a while. By 1800, about 5,000 people were playing cricket in just the 2 cities of Philadelphia and New York. 50 years after that, it spread to 22 more states and about 1,000 clubs. And newspapers would often cover cricket a lot more than baseball. And some of that is elitism because the people who were playing cricket were often from a higher class. And one of those clubs had been founded in Haverford in 1833. But in 1844, the USA hosted Canada for the first ever international sporting match of any kind. Sorry, yachting fans. And the story is actually a little bit weird. In 1840, a man called Phil Potts invited the St. George's Club of New York to Toronto for a match, but it was actually a giant hoax. But the Canadians were nice even back then, so they assembled some players and had a match. And so in 1844, the Canadians came over for the first ever international sporting contest. And Canada won by 23 runs in front of what is reported to be at least 5,000 people, and some sources even say 10,000. And the USA and Canada still play cricket matches for the K.A. Auty Cup today. It is the longest running rivalry between any two countries in any sport. In 1859, a group of English cricketers toured North America. This was the first English cricket squad to tour, well, pretty much anywhere. A very strong team consisting of George Parr, John Wisden, Robert Carpenter, William Caffin, H.H. Stevenson, and John Lillywhite. 2 more teams came from England in 1868 and 1873. And W.G. Grace was part of both of those sides. Cricket was at the peak of its popularity in the US around this period, but the first blow came during the Civil War. The soldiers at the camps realized that baseball took only a couple of hours and could be played pretty much anywhere. But cricket lasted all day and it also needed a pitch to be prepared over time. It's not the easiest thing to do if you are a soldier. You also had people like Harry Wright, who was a bowler and coach at St. George's Club in New York and the Union Cricket Club in Cincinnati. He also played, a little bit of the baseball. The Cincinnati Red Stockings signed him up after the Civil War. And he took a lot of his strategies, batting techniques and field placements from cricket to baseball. And in 1869, the Red Stockings played 57 matches and they lost none of them. Everyone wanted to be like them. And as they became popular, so did baseball. And cricketers began to switch sports at a massive rate. Baseball established itself as the people's sport of the United States. Cricket became restricted to pretty much the elite. And within the next 50 years, cricket was almost dead and baseball was the national pastime. But the amateurs refused to give it up. Cricket did not have the people, but it had the money. The elite still played and talked about it. And by the 1880s, Philadelphia emerged as a superpower of US cricket. They formed a team by recruiting from clubs like Germantown, Marion, Belmont, and Philadelphia itself. Sometimes they played as Philadelphia, and occasionally as the Gentlemen of Philadelphia. In all, they won 29 first-class matches and lost 45, including 3 tours of England, and they also went to Jamaica. Ranji Horden, who played 7 test matches for Australia, also played for Philadelphia. There was also George Patterson, whose 271 is still the highest first-class score for an Association Nations cricketer. John Thayer toured England with Philadelphia in 1884, and on April 15, 1912, he became the only first-class cricketer to sink with the Titanic, and hopefully the last one to do it. The Halifax Cup was a club tournament in Philadelphia that ran from 1890 to 1926. From 1911, the matches had 10 ball overs, more than a century before England introduced that for the 100. Yet cricket was fast approaching a decline. When the ICC was formed in 1909, they had Australia, England and South Africa, but not the USA. And that was by design. South Africa suggested that it should be Commonwealth only. This and the fact that many of the American elites had found tennis and golf meant that they didn't really fight for themselves. So no first-class matches were played in Philadelphia after the First World War. And once Babe Ruth happened to America, cricket just never stood a chance against baseball. But a few years later, it kind of resurfaced on the other side of the country in a very weird way. C. Aubrey Smith had led England in South Africa's first ever test match. A fine stage actor, he later moved to cinema. And yeah, he was in a Tarzan movie. And he is a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Though it does fail to mention his 5 for 19 in his only test, or the fact that he took 346 first-class wickets at an average of 22. But 1932 was an important year in American cricket because Arthur Maley organised a tour of Australian cricketers to North America. The squad included Don Bradman. And he was being publicised as the Babe Ruth of cricket. Bradman made 3,771 runs on that tour, took 6 wickets in an 8-ball over and met Babe Ruth. In the same year, C. Aubrey Smith and Boris Karloff started teaching cricket at the University of California in Los Angeles. And Smith founded the Hollywood Cricket Club. Karloff, P.G. Woodhouse, Cary Grant, Errol Flynn, Lawrence Oliver were all members at one point or another. The matches were not quite Test cricket level, but the HCC kept cricket relevant in the West Coast of America. And if you don't know who Boris Karloff was, well, we mentioned him at the top of the show. He is most famous for his role as Frankenstein's monster. He was a huge movie star, but he was also a wicketkeeper. And I am not saying those two things are related. The USA kept having small brushes with cricket after that. In 1959-60, President Dwight Eisenhower attended a test match in Karachi and played a big part in the fact that Pakistan would never play on a synthetic wicket ever again. The next year, the United States of America Cricket Association was founded. The next year after that, the Aussie Cup resumed after a 50-year hiatus. 3 years later, the USA became an ICC associate member. But, quite clearly, cricket never regained its popularity from the 1800s. In fact, it took a long time to have any kind of resurgence at all, and that was largely down to expats and also the fact that Cricinfo was there for American audiences. Cricket in America really wouldn't have survived without subcontinental people moving over and Caribbean people moving up. And, lots of students. But the ICC launched a Champions Trophy in 1998, and initially they toyed with the idea of hosting the inaugural edition in Walt Disney in Florida. They eventually settled for Dakar, the second happiest place on earth. In 2004, the USA won the ICC Six Nations Challenges to qualify for the Champions Trophy. In 2006, they qualified for the Under-19 World Cup, and they finished above 4 other sides. But in terms of glamour and interest, nothing matched the 2015 Cricket All-Stars. 2 sides played, Sachin's Blasters and Warne's Warriors, for 3 T20 games. Obviously, Tendulkar and Warne being involved and being at Times Square was a big deal. But there was also Lara, Callis, Mahela, Sangha, Donald, Pollock, Ambrose Walsh, Shoaib, Lee, McGrath, Murali, there were some names there. And they played the matches in baseball grounds in New York, Houston, and Los Angeles. And in America, I'd never seen cricket of this quality before. Well, cricketers who used to be of a high quality, now the fast bowlers looked like they were running through tar. In 2010, New Zealand and Sri Lanka played 3 T20 internationals in Florida. And to be honest, for a little while, New Zealand was really keen on having links with American cricket, but it never quite worked. But several teams since have gone to Fort Lauderdale to play games. And the IPL was also involved in that stadium. But T20 leagues have actually helped American cricketers a lot. Ali Khan, Hayden Walsh Jr., Stephen Taylor are all CPL stars at various times. Snigita Paul, Isani Vagala, Jatika Kadali were all part of the inaugural Women's CPL and the 60. In fact, Kadali was only 14 when she debuted for the USA, and at 18, she led their under-19s to a 4-1 win against the West Indies under-19s. Since then, she's also become the first bowler to take a hat-trick at the 60. However, the exposure for some of their players has also drawn away from the US, because Hayden Walsh Jr. has ended up going to play for the West Indies. But of course, there's been many other players who played for other sides who've gone on to play for the USA, like Clayton Lambert, Xavier Marshall, and Rusty Theron. And Corey Anderson is the biggest star, quite literally in his case, of the current team. But many of their players at this World Cup learn their cricket, at least at certain times, in other nations. So the USA team, as we see them in this World Cup, are a bit of a hodgepodge. They are sewn together from many different parts to make something far bigger than themselves. But they opened up this World Cup by turning around a match that they were out of against their arch rivals of more than 150 years. And then against Pakistan, they had one of the greatest upsets in cricket history. There is no doubt that US cricket is a Frankenstein's monster right now. But what is next? Because this is the biggest sports market in the world, an ancient game with some weird roots there. So the real question is not what they are now, but when cricket and the USA finally come together, what monster will they become next? If you make any content, Minvo Pro is the tool for you. Take your long format content and cut it and slice it for social media. This AI-inspired weapon will turn your one piece of work into so many clips. Try Minvo.pro now.